Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. The anticipated trade landscape for 2025 likely will involve substantial disruption and uncertainty. President-elect Trump has proposed substantial tariffs aimed at reshaping U.S. trade relations and encouraging domestic manufacturing. The impacts of these tariffs may drive cost increases across supply chains. Joining me to discuss how the election outcome could influence global trade policies and dynamics in the short term and the long term is Desmond. Chris, welcome. So good to see you again.
Thank you, Sindhu. Great to be here.
So the election happened, and we now know that President-elect Trump he's going to take office on January 20th and has some plans for tariffs. So I want to find out from you, if I'm a leading multinational corporation CEO or any kind of that C-suite position, what are you thinking with respect to potential impact?
This is an unknown time where companies need to figure out what this could mean. And companies are quickly now doing the calculations to figure out all of the rumored tariffs that Trump has had in his campaign. What could that do to their operating model from a U.S. perspective? And so what we're seeing right now on the market is companies are looking at things from a near-term perspective between now and January 20th, when he would take office, between the first 100 days of January 20th onward, and then for the whole calendar year. And so if you think about it, that first bit between now and January 20th, this is the time period where if there are any tariffs to go in play, call it January 20th and right afterwards, you can get things over the border now and you would have that safety net. But at the same time, multinationals are doing some modeling to say, what would the potential tariffs look like? We're looking at between, an increase of a lot of China tariffs from 25 to 60%, over double.
Right.
For Mexico, we're looking at 25%, which can happen overnight through an executive order. That's the big one that companies are really taken back by because we have USMCA, we have free trade agreements. This is going to be on top of that. That means maquiladora structures, toll manufacturers, contract manufacturers, that is put aside. If the product crosses the U.S. border, a tariff would be applied because that's the best information we have to work with. Then for the rest of the world, we're looking at somewhere between 10 to 20% tariffs. And these are staggering numbers because if you are a company, a multinational, you're looking at your cost base. And so if you have the ability to get inventory to the U.S. quickly now, you have a brief safety zone of non-tariff products, especially from non-China of origin locations. But the rest of the world, and as I mentioned earlier, the China and Mexico could be happening overnight because of executive order. But then the rest of the world, what does that mean to your operating model? Because most companies, they don't have that flexibility to absorb a cost item such as a 10 to 20% tariff all the way across the board.
As you know, on Policy on Demand, the bulk of our coverage is related to tax policy. But I have to tell you that across the board, everyone I'm speaking with and saying, what are companies talking about? Tariffs. It's at the top of the list. So talk about what this does for the tax department and what the tax director should be aware of.
Let's back up a little bit and let's go into the big picture. So what we're doing a lot of is modeling. We're modeling the potential impact. And if you think about it, the modeling of the impact is happening with the C-suite, logistics, supply chain, and they're figuring out what our options are. Because the modeling that we're doing for companies now, the numbers are a bit staggering because you think about this huge amount of additional costs where companies are really contemplating different operating model changes. So when that's happening, if you're the head of tax, you're looking at this saying, we might have some potential operating model changes, lift and shift of supply. We might onshore onto the U.S. What does this mean to my tax operating model, near and short term? And how do I react to it? And being a tax person myself most of my career as a transfer pricing economist, I always think of, well, what about all of your related party transactions and your documentation? Because if you have a pre-tariff impact and a post-tariff impact under the Trump administration, how does that vary to what I've done in my policy, my benchmarking? Sure. And how do I plan for that? But having a point of view from a tax director perspective on the different potential changes and being able to come to the table when a company has to look at the holistic picture and look at the net impact across the board. And then when they talk about a potential change, to an operating model, what does that mean for cost, supply, logistics? When we get to tax, having that point of view from a tax perspective is going to be very important. So to get ahead of the analytics and those conversations would be a smart thing.
Okay, thank you for that. And I want to turn next to retaliatory tariffs. If you could talk about what those are and how is that going to affect evaluation of company supply chains? And when should companies start looking into this? Is it before the new administration comes into office or after or both?
I think companies are already looking into that because everybody kind of knows what's been said about the proposed tariffs. And then we'll see what does that mean for retaliatory tariffs. So when we talk about retaliatory tariffs, we're really looking at the locations throughout the world that is other than China and typically maybe Mexico, but really the rest of the world. Because when you think about it, in the first 100 days, that's what we're generally hearing of when we would have tariffs implemented, either through executive order or other processes. And it's those tariffs that might be to the rest of the world, throughout Europe, South America. Those locations are not going to be happy.
Right.
And so we can then see potential retaliatory tariffs on different countries in the EU of U.S. exported goods. Now you have another modeling exercise that has to be done to say, what does that look like to my overall system-wide profits? What does that mean from my tax perspective in those jurisdictions? And who's going to pay for this? Is it going to be my related party, my third-party customer? Are we going to pass it on to the ultimate customer? So getting ahead of the modeling and doing the what-if analysis is super important, but it comes down to getting the right data to do this as well.
So let's turn to pricing. And I just want to comment that for the longest time,
yes,
if you're reading, watching, or listening to the news, you've heard about the cost of things and how prices are. So how does all of this affect pricing strategy for companies?
It really depends on who's going to pay. I was just listening to some information about even in China, the country has been subsidizing a lot of the companies there in order to reduce the cost so that the price from China origin goods to the US is still on par even after the current tariffs. And so they're looking to make sure that China's being competitive in pricing with the tariffs. If the switch goes from 25% to 60 over double, that's going to become even more difficult for different agencies to deal with that. So then the question becomes, does that, because when you think about tariffs are paid upon importation in the US. So the US company has to pay the importation tariff. That's where the payment's made. The question becomes, do they absorb it? Do they pass part of it on, all of it on to their customer or the ultimate customer? That's the modeling exercise that's being done. But there's a lot of studies that you'll see in the news that talk about the actual impact of a household. For you and I, when we're going out and shopping during the holiday season and thinking through what we're going to get, there might be a potential uplift a year from now of those costs to us as the individual consumer. But we have to see how that's going to play out because in some industries, they're looking to make sure that that cost is perhaps passed back or somewhere else in the supply chain.
And now sectors and industries, which ones are going to be most affected?
Well, any company that imports tangible property goods into the United States is going to be affected. And so it has to be physical products. So if people drop shift from China to somewhere else that doesn't get to the US, not going to be impacted. But if the actual product crosses the border, all of those industries are going to be impacted. Now it's a matter of, okay, what are they bringing in? Raw material, finished goods. What are their margins? Can they pass it on to customers? Can they change, the country of origin to somewhere else? Can they use substantial transformation to make it so that it's not country of origin China? All of these things are in play. And just to let you know, so I'm meeting with a lot of companies out there, and the numbers are staggering on how big these tariffs are going to be. We're probably going to see, at least what we are hearing, some companies making bigger changes than we thought since 2018, because now it's a really important time to reset the operating model on fit for purpose operations.
Right. Let's turn to considerations that companies should be taking, and specifically when it comes to M&A deals, where should their thinking be, or what are you learning from conversations you're having? M&A
deals are really interesting right now. We're seeing companies pause because they're partway through a deal, especially after we know which candidate is going to be president, knowing that there's a lingering tariff amount. That's a cost that may not have been factored into the deal. And the acquiring companies want to know, hey, we need to factor that in. If that's a factor, we need to model that out because that now has to be part of the deal. Otherwise, the deal's a little bit upside down in the benefit calculations. So we're getting pulled into a lot of M&A deal analyses now because that is a key piece of consideration. And I think that any company that is considering an M&A deal needs to consider the potential tariffs, not only from the US side, but retaliatory tariffs too, because if you're going to make that purchase and you're going to have a long-term, call it outlay of 1, 3, 5 years, you want to know what your ROI is going to be. And that's a key factor that needs to be brought in.
Chris, thank you so much. This has been really great. And I have a feeling this is not the last time we are going to be talking about this.
Love it.
Thank you. This episode is part of a series looking at different policy initiatives under the second Trump administration. You can find other episodes in the series on our website and linked in the description of this episode. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Take care.